Hello everyone, my name is Pally and I'm an OG 2016 DBD nerd who's been a Trapper main since Trapper was the best and only killer in Dead by Daylight. Today I'm going to be talking about the killer that Dead by Daylight seemingly left behind. Of course I'm talking about my main man, Evan McMillan himself, the Trapper. I'm also going to talk about what behavior can do to make the Trapper a better killer, but on the flip side of that, I'm also going to talk about what they can't and shouldn't do, and while some of this might surprise you, please hear me out. Now, before I talk about where the Trapper should go, I want to talk about where he's been. I want to talk about the journey he's had. I won't go into everything about the old days of Trapper because there's a lot and we'd be here all day, but there's just a few things I want to touch on just to show you that yes, he's a much better killer than he used to be. The Trapper is, as you know, the poster boy of Dead by Daylight. He's the face of the game, and in addition to that, he was also the very first killer in the game in its pre-release state. There was even a time when the Trapper was a better killer than the Hillbilly. Don't believe me? Well, for those of you that aren't aware, there used to be something called infinites in Dead by Daylight. And back in the day, an infinite was classified as a very strong loop where if ran correctly, which back then was not hard, the killer could quite literally never catch up to you. There are still situations where if ran skillfully against a 110 killer and a bit of shift teching, you can create infinites to this day, but not nearly as easy as you could before. Some examples of the old infinites in DBD are when all the windows in Wretched Shop were opened and were surrounded by God pallets, or when there was no door to walk through next to the window in Ironworks of Misery. Or if we go even further back, Cowtree on Coldwind was just 2 vaults with no pallet. And to make things even worse, not only was there no medium vault back then, so you had nothing but fast vaults pretty much, there was also no bloodlust or entity blocker, so the survivor could just vault and vault and vault with no downside. These were literally infinite loops, and the Trapper is the only one at the time who was capable of shutting them down. At least until survivors started sabotaging his traps. Yes, survivors used to be able to sabotage the Trapper's traps, and unlike hooks, they never respawned. Once they were sabotaged, they were just gone. And if survivors sabotaged all of his traps, he was left without a power and he was basically just man with machete for the rest of the game. And believe it or not, there was even a time when he couldn't even reset his traps. He had to pick them up and replace them down just to reset them, which was unfortunate if you already had the maximum amount of traps in your inventory, which at the beginning was only 1. This is a change that didn't come until 2020, and as you saw at the beginning, one of the worst things was how long it used to take to set a trap. Even if the animation was cool as hell, it took a long time. He had a lot of strengths, but also a lot of really broken weaknesses. Thankfully, most of those broken weaknesses have been completely removed, the key word being most. Now fast forward to present day, and if you look at pretty much anyone's tier list, the Trapper is at the very bottom. Unless of course you're one of those edible loving nerds who thinks he's above Huntress on a tier list, and well, not everyone has a good opinion. Another thing you'll find people say a lot about Trapper is that he's technically the most buffed killer in the game, meaning that no one has received as many buffs, either direct or indirect, as the Trapper has, which is technically true. Not only has Trapper benefited from every overall killer buff in the game, but he's also had a lot of buffs over time to his base kit. His trap setting speed is faster than it used to be, he can reset his traps, he has haste after setting or resetting a trap, survivors can no longer sabotage his traps, and to top it off, he has one of the most solid and all-around great and balanced sets of add-ons out of any killer in the game. Overall, he's in a much better spot in terms of strength than he used to be. So the question is, why is Trapper still so bad? Despite all of the direct and indirect buffs over the years that he's received, why is Trapper still at the bottom of people's tier lists? Well, the truth is, even though he's received all these buffs, there's just still so much holding him back. The single biggest thing holding him back right now is he's a setup killer, which on the surface isn't a bad thing, of course. There's other setup killers, but Trapper is the only setup killer that in addition to having to set up his power, he has to first walk around the map and collect his power. The issue with this is that it doesn't really matter how much generator slowdown you have, there's just not enough time in most games to have an ideal trap setup. On top of that, against even a semi-competent survive with friends, whether it's a 4-stack or even just a 2-stack, but let's just say if one knows where your traps are, so do the rest of the people in their party. These two things alone mean that oftentimes you won't even be playing for traps, but rather using your traps for zoning, which is why you see me running fastening tools so much, because it helps so much with that playstyle. Oh, and survivor map items, you know, like the rainbow map or even the green map with like add-ons, just straight up tells you where Trapper's traps are. No downside, just tells you where his power is. Like his power is useless if a survivor brings a map. Isn't that just great? Another thing holding him back a lot is that to compensate for how limited his setup power is in terms of time, he doesn't have anything substantial in chase to make up for it. The most you can do in chase is either set up a trap in chase or fake setting up a trap for zoning. Even the haste he gets after setting up the trap doesn't really do anything because all the survivor has to do is shift W to negate it completely. It's meaningless. And that brings me to his traps. They don't really mean anything. They don't really accomplish anything. Most of the time, survivors get out of them instantly, or they just disarm them very quickly with absolutely zero downside for them, completely for free, and they provide almost no pressure most of the time. As the cherry on top of all of that, a lot of the time, winning as Trapper simply depends solely and entirely on how many mistakes the survivors are making. And that brings me to hands down one of the worst things and biggest things holding the Trapper back: maps. It seems like the more maps behavior releases or updates, the less places for traps there are. You often hear people saying Badham is one of the worst maps in the game, but us Trapper players, we're just happy to see grass in a map. Some good examples of awful Trapper maps are the two newest maps, Ormond Lake Mine and Dead Sands. Even though the maps themselves, balance-wise, I don't have an issue with, but for Trapper, would it hurt to have a little bit of grass, just a little bit somewhere? Or at least not have most of the pallets be untrappable? You've seen it, a lot of the pallets now, like the gap in the pallet is just too big to trap. The traps do nothing, so you're left with just hoping the survivors are blind, and that doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good to have to solely rely on your opponents being incompetent, for lack of a better word. And circling back to maps and having grass on maps, some of the maps have grass. There is tons of grass on some of the maps, but none of it in any useful spot. A good example of this is the Shattered Square map on Borgo. I always make the joke that it has grass but also has no grass at the same time. It's funny, but it's also very accurate. The point is, there's just so many maps that are just terrible for traps, and that number seems to grow every time a new map is either created or an old map is reworked. So the question remains, how can we make Trapper strong? How can we make him a formidable opponent against even skilled survivors? How can we make him not rely on the mistakes of his opponents? And the answer is, you can't. Well, at least, not really. Don't get me wrong, there are things you could do to help his quality of life and make him not so reliant on survivor mistakes, and we'll talk about those. But due to the nature of what his power is at its core, there's a limit to how strong he can be, otherwise he'll end up just being the most annoying and hated killer in the game, and we don't want to see Trapper end up on the old chopping block like another killer we know. Recently, Otstarva released a video called The Elephant in DBD's Room, and when people told me it was about Trapper, I was excited to see it, but then when I watched the video, it made me a bit sad. In the video, Ots went over a lot of the issues Trapper has, a lot of them we've talked about here today, but when the topic came up of buffing the Trapper to make him feel better to play, he quoted what Behavior has said in the past about being happy with his pick rate and kill rate, but I got the feeling that Ots had given up on trying to campaign for changes to our beloved Evan McMillan. He's just gotten tired of not being listened to. I recently had a brief conversation with Ots in DMs, and he pretty much confirmed that to me, but he did tell me he's happy to see that there's still people that are passionate about Trapper, and we also both mutually agreed that scene partner on Steve Harrington should be nerfed and banned. But the point is, even Otstarva has lost his passion for Trapper because of all the frustrating issues that Behavior just doesn't seem to care about. But here's the thing, while I don't think Behavior is right to just leave him as he is, I do understand why they don't want to make changes to him. He's pretty effective at lower levels, but also easy for the lower level of both killer and survivor players to understand. On paper, if you ignore the macro and the micro, he's simple, and I think that's how Behavior likes him. Now moving on from that, I've seen a lot of different people with a lot of different ideas for what they would do to Trapper, and I'll go through a few of them here and tell you why they aren't good ideas. Some of the things are just straight up jokes, like just nerf bloody coil and nothing else. And some of them just go overboard, and to the point where I'll hear them out and I'll immediately say, congratulations, you've just created the Skull Merchant. The number one thing, believe it or not, that I hear from people the most is to make him get his traps from lockers. Now, I can see why you might think this is a good idea. I see where you're coming from, but here's the issue. On a lot of maps, this would effectively be a nerf. Think for a second of how spread out and scarce lockers on maps like Swamp and Gideon's are, or geez, if you're on Hawkins, you might have to catch a flight to Guadalajara just to see a locker on the way there. That's how those walls and doors work on Hawkins. It's just so frustrating. And on these maps, like I said, this would effectively be a nerf. This kind of downside works for Huntress and Trickster because they can do ranged projectile damage with their power. Trapper can't do that. Trapper would have to obtain his power, he'd have to get his traps out of lockers, then have to go place them down. So getting traps from lockers is, as good as it sounds, just a poorly thought out idea. The next thing I hear the most from people is just give him all of his traps at the start of the game. And if you could go back a couple of years, you'd probably catch me saying the same thing, but the more I've thought about it, the more I realize this would overall be unhealthy. This would lower the skill floor of the Trapper to basically sub-basement level. Trap management is a huge part of mastering the Trapper, and this just removes that. Sure, in the hands of a newer player, this might not seem like a big deal, but in the hands of someone like me, or the best Trapper in the game, if you don't know him, Entity's left hand, it would actually be kind of broken. A change like this would literally just allow him to set up a 3-gen at the beginning of the game, and that just removes any sort of skilled play from the Trapper whatsoever, and it also is just a very boring playstyle. I don't know about you, but I don't even like playing that playstyle if I'm playing Trapper. If I have to do it, I'll do it, but it's always a last resort. Hell, I wouldn't even give him an extra trap in his inventory. 2 traps is the perfect base kit amount. Any more than that without having to sacrifice an add-on could fundamentally create a skull merchant situation of sorts, where he can set up an impossible web that just prolongs the game to an unhealthy amount of time. Another one of those changes that on paper sounds okay, but in practice isn't very well thought out. Lastly, another thing I hear a lot is give him Honing Stone as base kit. And for those that aren't aware, the Trapper's Honing Stone add-on is a very rare add-on that if a survivor steps into a trap and escapes from it themselves, they go into the dying state. The counter to it is that you have your teammate help you out of the trap, but because a teammate may not always be nearby, you either wait in the trap and get caught by the Trapper, or you just end up in the dying state. I love this add-on because it makes his traps meaningful, but as a base kit solution, it would be a wee bit too much. Those are just a few of the ideas that we've probably all seen get thrown around, and again, like I said, they sound good on paper, but they have major drawbacks in practice. Now I'll talk about the changes I think should be made to the Trapper. And I want to preface this by saying the sad truth is he will likely always be a fairly weak killer. And my changes are more or less designed in a way where they have the potential to make a world of difference for experienced players at the high end with little to no change at the low end, which is a balance method known as trickle-down balance, affecting high skill levels without negatively affecting low skill levels. And I think that's what behavior's after. Firstly, there's 3 add-ons I want to talk about. Trapper Gloves, Makeshift Wrap, and Lengthened Jaws. You can see them and their effects on screen, pause if you need to. All 3 of these add-ons should be made base kit. Faster trap setting speed would go a long way with skilled chase plays when playing the Trapper, and the ability to walk over your traps, well, let's just say this is a downside Trapper has had that he shouldn't have anymore. It's an outdated part of his kit, and he doesn't need that kind of hindrance anymore. It doesn't even make thematic sense. He's a master of traps. Why would they be a danger to him? As far as deep wounds is concerned, currently if a survivor steps in a trap and escapes immediately, they lose a health state. So if they're healthy, they walk away from it injured. But if they're already injured and they step in a trap, nothing happens. It has no effect, and they're almost always out within the first 2 escape attempts. So now you're just left with a disarmed trap and nothing to show for it. The goal with applying the deep wounds from Lengthened Jaws to his base kit is to make his traps meaningful. To make it so you don't just walk away with nothing to show for it if you get someone trapped across the map. I'll talk about what I would change these add-ons to now that they've been made base kit after I get through with the rest of my proposed changes. Now before we go any further, you will not see any nerfs here. I've seen a few people have their own takes on what they think should happen with the Trapper, and they all do the same compensate for buffs with nerfs nonsense. This has never been less necessary than it is with Trapper. Not every buff needs to be accompanied by a nerf to compensate, and no, before you say anything, Bloody Coil does not need to be nerfed. Not even a little bit. Moving on. Currently, the Trapper has a 7.5% haste effect for 5 seconds when setting or resetting a trap. On paper, this sounds okay, but in practice, a lot of this is negated simply by the survivor just shift Wing when the Trapper is stuck in the set or reset trap animation. I would bump this up to 10% haste for 7 seconds. This would create a more engaging chase gameplay loop and wouldn't make the Trapper feel, like they're damned if they do, damned if they don't in chase. To go along with this, I would also change the way trap escapes work. I would make it take a flat 8 seconds with normal skill checks during the escape, similar to Doctor's Madness, just without the skill checks bouncing all over your screen. This would require some number of tweaks on existing add-ons that already slow down trap escapes, but that's an easy fix. To go along with this, when a survivor is caught in a trap more than 32 meters away, the Trapper should gain 6% haste for 10 seconds. These two things would make your traps actually mean something and make them have an impact. But these changes would also reward the trapper for their trap instead of it just resulting in a trap being deactivated because the survivor was trapped across the map and escaped in 2 seconds. The final base kit change is my idea to solve the issue of Trapper having to collect his power from across the map, and I call it the Trap Recall. To explain what this is, say you're playing Trapper and you have no traps. In this situation, what you would do is look across the map at any one of the trap auras that you can see, and you'll see the red flame icon over it, and at that point, you can instantly recall that trap to your inventory with the press of a button. And after you use this ability, it goes on cooldown for 15 seconds. And during the cooldown, your ability to pick up traps off the ground like normal is completely unaffected. Now you're probably thinking, this does nothing. Well, you'd be wrong. At higher levels, a change like this can make a world of difference, with almost no difference being made at lower levels. The goal with this is to reward high skill play but not hurt lower skilled play. It does what it needs to do without removing the simplicity of Trapper that Behavior is such a huge fan of. Oh, and his trap should no longer be visible on survivor map items. I don't know why I didn't mention that before. A simple change to an outdated mechanic. Now let's circle back to those add-ons. You know, the ones we made base kit? Now here's what I'd do with each of them now that their existing effects would be base kit. We'll start with the Trapper Gloves. The new effect for Trapper Gloves will increase the speed of the trap pickup animation by 50%. This is a pretty self-explanatory change. It'd be one of those really nice feel-good add-ons, but you wouldn't see it everywhere. Now moving on to the Makeshift Wrap. The new effect for that add-on would be when a trap is disarmed by the trapper walking over it, it rearms itself in 10 seconds. This is also pretty self-explanatory, and it also keeps it close to what it used to be, but this would allow for some really cool mind game potential. And I happen to think this would actually be a very popular add-on. Now, moving on to Lengthened Jaws. For me, I was thinking about it a lot, and the new effect I would give to Lengthened Jaws is, when a trap is disarmed within 10 meters of the trapper, the survivor who disarmed it is inflicted with a 5% hinder for 7 seconds. This would add some risk to the Survive with Friends factor, where they like to disarm traps right next to you when you're in a chase with their teammate. It won't make a huge impact, but as I said, it adds risk. It would likely result in an injure for your trouble. Now, there is one add-on that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is the Tar Bottle. I would change the Tar Bottle add-on to have an adaptive trap effect rather than just straight darkening of the traps. Traps will loosely blend in with whatever environment they are on, whether that be a sand color on Area Crows or an off-white color on Ormond Lake Mine. It wouldn't have to match the color of the ground perfectly, mind you, just to allow for adequate counterplay, but enough where if you aren't paying attention you may not notice it, and it wouldn't just be an eyesore that you can see in your peripheral vision. I can't produce any examples of this, but again, it seems pretty self-explanatory, and I think it would go a long way. The reason I would apply this effect to the Tar Bottle is because Tar Bottle is largely useless these days with how bright maps have gotten. Other than that, I wouldn't really do anything else. I know on paper it seems underwhelming, but the goal is trickle-down balance, where it's effective at the high end for people who have a good grasp on the macro and micro of the killer, but not so much at the lower end. At the high end, in the hands of a seasoned Trapper player, these changes would be huge. But as I said, truthfully, we have to accept that the Trapper will never be a super strong killer, but we can't deny that these changes would make him feel a lot better. When it comes down to it, my motivation for going this direction with my ideas for the Trapper is because a lot of other people's ideas are either hilariously underwhelming from people who very evidently don't play Trapper very often and don't understand the micro and macro play he has, or they just go overboard to the point where he'd end up being hated and likely nerfed into a state of oblivion where he's worse than he is now. So I went with ideas that, to be honest, if someone were to complain, it would be really easy to point and laugh and say skill issue. At the end of the day, the Trapper needs some love. We know he does. He's the killer who's been in the fog the longest, and he needs help. And I can only hope and dream that someone from Behavior would see this video and maybe take some of my ideas to heart. It would mean the world to me if I thought I could make any difference at all for my boy Evan. But what do you guys think? Do you like my changes? Do you think you have better ideas? Let me know in the comments below. Also, on a personal note, I apologize for not uploading for a bit. I've had some recent sad news in my family, so my priorities shifted for a bit, but we keep on going, right? If you guys would like to catch me live doing all the things killer in DBD and the occasional bit of Survivor, you can catch me over on my Twitch at twitch.tv/PallyLive, where I stream either 4 or 5 days a week, and you can also find me on my other socials, which are in the description below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, you guys are awesome, and I will see you in the next one.